Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for coming to this Growth Commission briefing. The Growth Commission, I think the fact that you're here will suggest you know what we are, but for those of you who are watching the video, the Growth Commission is a group of non-partisan, independent, international economists who model the impact of fiscal and policy proposals on GDP per capita growth. And we've got a dozen economists from around the world, from Britain, from America, Mexico, India, Japan, on the commission. But obviously this event today is very much focused on the spring statement happening on Wednesday. We will be moderated today by Liam Halligan, who is a journalist, commentator, podcaster, author, and his columns in the Sunday Telegraph are essential reading. And then there'll be a presentation by Shanker Singham, who is the chairman of the Growth Commission. He will guide through key points in the document which are on your chairs. And then there'll be a discussion also bringing in Lord Moynihan, who is a peer, an author, philanthropist, businessman, and indeed author of the 2-volume bite-back book, Return to Growth, which I recommend you all. When we go through to the discussion later, there will be this roving mic will go around the room. Just 2 points though. We are being filmed, so don't stand up because you'll obscure the view for people who are watching the video. And wait until the mic is in your hand, otherwise the people watching at home won't be able to hear you. I think that's all the housekeeping I need to give. I'll hand the floor to Liam.
Thank you, Jonathan. Very nice to be here. I'm Liam Halligan. Nice to hear that my columns are essential reading. I must check them out sometime. What is essential reading is when the facts change Substack. That's what you got to subscribe to, which I also author. So it's Winston Churchill who said, when a nation tries to tax its way to prosperity, it's like a man standing in a bucket trying to pull himself up. And I think for many people in this room, that will be their diagnosis too of where we currently are, where the UK economy stands on the eve of this spring budget, because let's call it what it is. It is a spring budget, make no bones about it. Since the Halloween budget, October, Labour's first budget in 14 years, growth has, of course, not just stalled but gone backwards. We actually had a GDP contraction on the first round of the official numbers in January after the economy flatlined in the fourth quarter of 2024. And I think many would agree, and certainly Andrew Bailey himself has acknowledged that a big reason for that stalling of growth was just the prospects of the tax rises announced in October, because of course, for the most part, they haven't even come in yet. The £25 billion increase in employer national insurance contributions hasn't come in yet. The 6.7% increase in the minimum wage, 16.3% increase for those between 18 and 21. How does that work when you're trying to get young people back into work? They haven't come in yet. They come in at the beginning of the next fiscal year, of course, which is early April. And yet we've seen growth stall, be squeezed out of the system. Yes, the world has changed, and I think we're going to hear a lot about that today, not least from Shanker, who is, of course, one of our leading trade experts, as well as being chair of the Growth Commission. The world has changed to some degree, but the world always changes. But it was clear, even in the first few weeks after that October budget, the impact it was having on businesses, the impact it was having on business sentiment. PMI surveys, CBI surveys, IOD surveys, all registering the worst conditions for business since COVID lockdown, which is a pretty big achievement. Not. So that's where we are. I think it's fair to say that we all understand in this room that when growth is curtailed and even goes into reverse, it pulls the public finances apart in both directions. I don't think that fact is widely understood, certainly not among a lot of our media class, of which of course I am a part. Because of course when growth stalls, you don't get nearly as much tax revenue as you thought you were going to get. You need much more benefit spending and support for the economy unless you change policy, which is, of course, very, very difficult. And talking about changing welfare policy, of course, even if these reforms go through, we're talking about a £5 billion a year saving from a budget government spending of 1.3 trillion, 1,300 billion, which is nothing. And the reforms are likely to be watered down. Consider, because we've had much slower growth than the OBR predicted, their own prediction, of course, we expect to be cut from 2% to 1% for this coming year, with the Bank of England itself having cut its growth prediction from 1.5% to 0.75%. Because we've had this growth slowdown and even contraction in January, that is why government borrowing in February alone wasn't 6.5 billion, as the OBR said it would be. It was 10.7 billion. So just the overshoot in borrowing in 1 month is the same almost as the entire welfare saving in a single year if we go through this political fire and brimstone. I mean, is our political class in the real world? I certainly don't think so, but who cares what I think? What really matters is what the gnomes of Zurich think. Am I allowed to still call them that? The phrase I first heard in a pub in Willesden Green, listening to grown men and women talking about the economy, people from the building trade within which I grew up, makes you very sensitive to the economy. It's why I became an economist, watching the economy and the ups and downs tear families apart, have massive implications socially. We all know that the bond markets are on a knife edge. We all know, because we're all financially literate in this room, that for months now, the 10-year gilt yield has been way above what it was at the peak of the so-called mini-budget crisis. Oh, there's Liz Truss in the front row to remind me of that. But she doesn't need to remind me of that, because everyone who follows financial markets knows that. And yet, where is the outcry? That is why we are now spending in excess of £100 billion on debt interest. That is why a chunky share of the borrowing since Labour came into office, over 50% in most months, is actually money borrowed to pay the interest on existing debt. Well, when I was a young, thrusting, emerging markets analyst, that was called a Ponzi scheme. And that is my concern. So that's the outline. That's where we are. So we have, of course, Shanker Singham, well known to this audience. Great to have you here, Shanker. Glad you got through the Heathrow electricity resilience crisis. And, of course, John Moynihan, who wrote the excellent magisterial double-volume Return to Growth. And it's good to see you, John. Now you're back in circulation, having carried out that enormous project. And thank you for doing it. It's a fabulous read. Shanker, we're going to come on to what the Growth Commission wants to do, how you think you can engender growth. We're also going to ask you about trade, because I know that you feel, in keeping with the Chancellor actually, the world has changed, not least in your specialised area. But tell us about the headlines of how the Growth Commission feels we can get out of this growth, low growth, high spending, high tax trap. Shanker Singham.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Whoop. Thank you, Liam. Welcome to everybody. Thanks for coming today for this Growth Commission statement. As you'll see on your chairs, we have a statement that the Growth Commission released today. It is in anticipation of the Spring Statement on the 26th of March that Rachel Reeves will present in Parliament. Essentially, we think there are three crises that the UK faces, possibly four actually. The first is a growth crisis that Liam sort of talked a little bit about, and if you look at the UK versus US GDP per capita, for example.
I'm going to stand over there.
And then you can see what's happened to the UK GDP per capita going back some time now. There were points. Some of that point where the UK is above the US is a currency point, but the point is made that we were fairly close to US GDP per capita in the early 2000s, and we are now about 60% of US GDP per capita. And the US is not a perfect benchmark, right? So the US hasn't done everything right. But even with that, we are in a significant growth crisis. Liam mentioned the contraction in GDP, and of course we've added, so between June and January there's been a 0.1% reduction in GDP, but in the course of that period we've added 600,000 people to the population, or possibly more than that. So your GDP per capita, which is what we focus on, it's a better proxy for household income, is actually considerably down. The second crisis is a fiscal crisis. And again, Liam talked a little bit about that. The revenue shortfall versus spending overrun is about 38 billion at this. It's an annual rate of 38 billion at this point. And the third crisis that we have is the export crisis. And these are interesting. This is interesting data because what you can see the COVID, collapse there, which is totally understandable, of course, given the lockdown. But what you do see is through the transition period that when the UK left the EU and beyond, exports are going up. Now, bear in mind that while the UK did not implement the full force of customs and import controls, the EU did on day one. And so you cannot ascribe what's happening at the end of this period to either the COVID lockdown or to Brexit, really. Something else is happening, and that is of deep concern to us, and I think that's going to be particularly affected by the sort of elephant in the room that I'll continue to talk about, which is, of course, the change in the US presidency and the change in the US approach, where significant trade restrictions or tariffs will be in place against a number, possibly all, of the G20 countries. So that's going to have another effect on this export crisis. The fourth crisis that I will talk a little bit about is, and it is affecting all of these three things, is the energy crisis in the UK, and that is a cost of energy crisis. I'll just go to that one. This is from a Growth Commission statement to or a Growth Commission memo for the President-elect in the US, which we wrote before the election, so it was to whoever was going to win the election, and it was presented in November in Congress. And what we were basically saying to the incoming US President is, don't be like the UK. Whatever you do, because there was a possibility you would have had a Democrat president who was quite enamored of European regulatory barriers in the energy space. Don't do that. Don't be like the UK. Look what happened to the UK. Look at energy cost in the UK compared to other countries. The only country that sort of comes close to the UK's rate of increase is Norway. But essentially, we have the highest energy costs in the world. They're about 4 times what the US energy cost is. It is impossible to be a competitive country. It is impossible to have a manufacturing base of any kind if you don't tackle those energy costs. So we make a number of recommendations that you have there. So if we start with public spending, what we've done here, which is different to the Growth Commission's usual pre-budget statements, is normally we look at the 20-year projection because we are concerned about long-term measures to grow GDP per capita. We think the UK is in multiple crises at the moment, and therefore we're not doing long-term measures. What we're doing here and what we think the Chancellor should do on Wednesday, are emergency measures. And those emergency measures in the area of public spending, for example, firstly, is I think the Prime Minister actually referred to public sector productivity declining, 8.5% It's 8.5% lower than it was before the pandemic. Now, there's certain actions that the government's taken we support. We support eliminating some of the regulators that are out there, sort of independent, so-called independent regulators, payment systems regulator, for example. But we don't think that goes far enough. We think the Overton window on this type of change has radically changed because of what's happening in the US. I think if you can move at the pace that the US is moving on some of these things, I think it's saying to other countries, look, if we can do this, then you can do this. So that is changing that kind of dynamic. But just a word on the regulators, the independence of regulators. I think the question that we have to ask is, who are they independent from? I mean, in the UK, it seems to me that the regulators, many of the regulators, are independent from the people and independent from the elected representatives who represent the people, and actually quite captured by incumbent interests, and therefore will promote the status quo and so on. And that's what we kind of see. So we think there needs to be wholesale reform of that system. On tax, obviously we've got an immediate stop the bleeding situation, which is the fact that we have hundreds and thousands of previously non-dom people who are leaving, have left the country. It's hit a 4.3 billion immediate hit. It's going to rise to between 18 and 23 billion if it's not corrected. So we think reversing that is crucial. The income tax rate for people over £100,000 whose allowances is going to go up to 60 to 70%. That's completely unsustainable. We think the corporate tax rate needs to come down to the US. What's been touted in the US is what they're going to do, which is 21%. And then down, as we recommended previously, to 15 by 2035. Capital recovery, the UK has one of the least effective capital recovery systems in terms of depreciation of plant equipment and structures. So we think that needs to be corrected. We think the tourist tax is a big hit to the UK economy, and that needs to go as well. And then regulatory proposals. I'm going to say a bunch of things now that are going to be very, very unpopular. But I think we are in a emergency situation, as if I haven't already. But we are in an emergency situation, and I think therefore we're going to have to do them. On regulation, our models, and this isn't just one model. This is 5 different economic models that we've used, all show that the cost of regulatory damage in terms of its effect on GDP per capita is about 3 times the cost of your traditional trade barrier tariff kind of issues. It's about double the effect of not protecting property rights, for example, on GDP per capita, which is counterintuitive, but is nevertheless what our models are telling us. In that context, I think a couple of things. So on planning, we agree that planning with the government, the planning is a crucial thing to correct. We worry that the planning changes don't go far enough, that elimination of some of the role of statutory consultees in areas that are not the problem is not going to fix the problem. And unless you do this in areas like environmental and heritage, which is where most of the problems are in the planning system, you're not going to correct the problem. And I think that's the theme of our approach to what the government is doing. We like some of the things they're doing, but we don't think they're going far enough at all. So what we would prefer to see is a complete repeal and replacement of the Town and Country Planning Act, because that is the reason why these planning changes to the planning system in the UK are so difficult to do. So we'll spend a lot of time in Parliament trying to do things, and at the end of the day, the effect will be very small. And what you're looking for is what we talked about in our previous work, which is that of our initial projection back a year ago was we could find 26% GDP per capita growth in the UK economy over the next 20-year period. but about a third of that comes from planning reform, but this kind of planning reform. So that's the prize that you're looking for. So that's planning on energy, and this is where I'm probably going to be extremely unpopular. This curve is a reflection of what happened after the 2008 Climate Change Act. You are not going to correct the energy situation in the UK until you repeal the 2008 Climate Change Act. I'm not saying we don't care about climate change. There are many ways of tackling climate change. The 2008 Climate Change Act has been proven not to be one of them. And so we would repeal it and replace it with other things, and we've suggested some other things. The Climate and Freedom Accord that we tested, where countries come together and do things that are on the positive side in terms of encouraging low carbon energy production and that kind of thing. So there are other things that you can do. Do not follow the European CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. We evaluated that through Growth Commission previously. It's about £1,000 cost per UK person. Do not nationalise the rail companies. Do not create a national energy company. These will crowd out the private sector. We made previous recommendations on how to improve transportation and energy in the UK, following some of the recommendations, frankly, that have been made by the CMA in 2015. Labour market flexibility. This is one of the biggest drivers of economic growth and GDP per capita growth. So if you improve the UK's, what we call the domestic competition, which is the regulatory pillar, if you improve it by 1 point, it's the score between 1 and 7. So a 1 point improvement where the UK is now is roughly 15%, let's say. So improving the UK by 15% is the way to look at that. That's an 11% GDP per capita gain. Of that 11%, about 3 of it is labour market flexibility. So do not make your labour market less flexible. In fact, quite the reverse. Make it more flexible than it is now. So the labour market bill, the employment rights bill, I think, is also on the chopping block for these purposes. Bring the minimum wage into line with the OECD norm. The UK is an outlier. We have a minimum wage that is more than 2/3 of median income. It's way higher than the OECD norm. And then finally, the big elephant in the room, probably the thing that is going to dominate the discussions, is the US relationship. Now, what we've done here, so what's going to happen, and Liam will get into this in the conversation, but on April the 2nd, there is going to be a big tariff pretty much on all the G20 countries. Including the UK. And what I think we need to do, and what we've tried to do here, is to look at what is the choice that is going to be before the Chancellor and the government and the Secretary of State for Business and Trade. What we've modelled here is what happens if there is a 25% US tariff on the UK. Now, it might be less than that. It might be in certain lines. There's a CBR estimate of that. There's a NIESR estimate of the effect of that on the UK economy. These are GDP numbers, by the way. And what's the effect of the other point that you cannot disaggregate from this, which is the conversation we're having with the EU in terms of the reset and the potential veterinary agreement and dynamic alignment of SPS regulation. The impact of anti-competitive regulation, I've already said, is we've assumed here a 0.5 point reduction, which is not, we're talking about regulation because we lock into European proven anti-competitive regulation. We're talking about making the UK's regulatory system only about 6 or 7% less competitive to get these numbers. That's not very much. And I think it's going to be worse than that. Because the EU is not a static thing. If you look at the direction of travel of EU regulation, it is moving in an ever more anti-competitive direction. So this is that's the baked-in cost. Why is it up there? Because if you do that SPS, dynamic alignment, what is the US's #1 objective with the UK or the EU? It is to change your SPS regulatory regime. So if you take that off the table, then you're going to face this high tariff. Scenario 2 is you do the deal with the US, and there's a lot of things you can do in the reset with the EU that are to do with mutual recognition. I would say, with regard to the EU, do everything that does not cross these two lines: independent trade policy and domestic regulatory autonomy. And there's a lot you can do there. So we've assumed that you can get some benefits from that, and we've assumed the regulatory reform proposals again are sort of plus 7% for the UK, based on the freedom that you have to do many of the things we talked about. The difference, and with economic models, as a person who spends a lot of time on them, I will say don't fetishize them. This is not, I'm not saying these are the numbers. What I'm saying is what models are very, very powerful with is orders of magnitude and signs. Direction, exactly. So if you look at that and you say it's going to be minus a big number if we don't do a deal with the US, it's going to be plus a big number if we do a deal with the US, I think it's pretty obvious what you should do. So that choice is going to be upon us very quickly. That choice is going to be upon us shortly after April the 2nd. And it is, I think, imperative that we, I don't think we're going to have any choice. Liam mentioned the bond markets. I think if you're looking at 10-year yields and you don't do this, you are in a world of pain. So on that happy note, I will close. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shanker. So what we're going to do is, in the time we've got available, I want to romp through and give both of you a nibble on under each of these subject headings before we get to audience, because we've got some extremely knowledgeable, not just analysts, and we've got genuine players in this debate in the audience, of course. So I want to go through the climate change proposals from both of you, planning, then employment rights. Of course, the Employment Rights Bill is live. Even on the government's own estimates, it's going to cost businesses another $5 billion a year. Then I wanted to talk about the generality of what you're saying. There's the sort of looming economic principle under a lot of the Growth Commission's work and analysis is the Laffer curve. You're talking about lowering the rate of corporation tax very significantly. So let's talk about that. Is that a principle that we can re-inject into the debate in this country and indeed with the world watching across the Western world? And then I want to get in the final block of this section before we open it up to trade, asking you at first, Shanker, just generally where we are, because there's been a lot of misreporting, but you cover this for a living. And John, I must say, I felt among all the arresting analysis in Return to Growth, one passage that really struck with me was your analysis of US trade history, particularly Smoot-Hawley. I think you're one of the people who is really promoting this line, which many Trump supporters are trying to knock down as we speak, that this is a new Smoot-Hawley, and indeed that wave of US protectionism in the early 30s was what turned the Wall Street crash into Steinbeck's Dust Bowl Great Depression. So without further ado, Shanker, let's try and be quite clipped and brief in this so we can get to a bigger debate. Just give us a little bit more colour on your concerns about the Climate Change Act and how you think the Growth Commission's proposals could engender rather than stymie growth.
Yeah, I think you have to look at the whole everything, the emissions trading scheme, the potential for carbon border adjustment, and the underlying, the thing that underlies it all, which is the Climate Change Act. And you know, when the Climate Change Act came in, it basically imposed an £18 per tonne carbon floor price at a time when, if you compare that with the US at the time, the average sort of equivalent price for carbon was about $3 a tonne. So you start off at a massive disadvantage, and you're tinkering at the edges then to try to correct the situation. I think we have to take a very different approach to climate change, also bearing in mind the reality of the UK's contribution to it, and the contribution of others. And I think that one of the proposals we've talked about is this Climate and Freedom Accord, which is essentially an agreement amongst like-minded countries to adopt certain things like investment, various financial tools to encourage the development of low carbon energy and that kind of thing. But the main thing is you've got to start generating energy.
John, again, this is a big subject in your book. Do you think the Overton window is shifting here? How did you feel when you heard the Leader of the Opposition give a speech last week, which many people feel would have been politically impossible for a mainstream party just a few months ago?
I agree. And just before I start, I should just say that I thought this report from the Growth Commission is really important, and I really hope that it gets some publicity. That, as you say, the government does appear to be paying attention to what a lot of us have been saying over the past 6 months, and has been,
or at least the opposition,
has been changing course. So I would say that I'd go back to one of the first charts in that commission showing how exports were flattening out, and in fact it's primarily goods exports that are flattening out, and services are doing pretty fine. And why are they flattening out? Exactly what Shanker was talking about, the cost of energy. The manufacturing sector continues to collapse in this country because you cannot manufacture at that high level. So exactly what Shanker was saying, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. And the more renewables we put into the system as a percentage of the total, the more it goes up. We keep being told that the cost of renewables are going down, so they put more renewables in, and the overall cost of energy goes up. Now, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that this claim that renewables are driving costs down are completely wrong. And in an act of utter vandalism last week, the government ordered Quadrilla to pour concrete into the only working gas-fracked wells in this country, thus ensuring that they could never be reopened again. And while, yes, the government is doing some interesting things that we would applaud, as you and I were discussing before this, Liam, the two by far the most popular politicians in the Labour Party are Ed Miliband, who I'm sorry does appear to be mad, and if one is allowed to say that, and Angela Rayner, by far more popular than anybody. And as long as that is the case, it's going to be very, very difficult for them to reverse course on energy, and we're going to have a big problem. I mean, you said they seem to be doing some things right, and indeed, I've got a note somewhere. You know, they say they're going to do planning, welfare, but they've got a rebellion against that. They say they're going to cut civil servants, but really, it's not a huge number that they're saying they're going to cut. But anyway, they haven't done it yet, and if they have the same success as the previous government had, then they won't have any success at all, because the previous government said they'd get rid of civil servants, and every week the number's gone up and continues to go up. Departmental spending, they say they've been very brave about that, and NHS reform. So that they are saying that they're going to do a lot of good things, as you say, Liam, but it's really only tinkering around the edges, because I won't do it because I've taken up too much time, but the list of what they're failing to do and screwing up on is much longer.
Well, I'm sure a lot of that will come out in the Q&A as well. Yeah. Shanker, next heading, planning. A big chunk of the Growth Commission's proposed increase in growth comes from that planning reform. What do you think of what Labour's done so far, what it's proposing to do?
Well, I think, as John sort of intimated, I think the rhetoric is good, which is the starting point. I think some of the things that they've been doing and suggesting are actually, positive and could get you to some of that 7 or 8% GDP per capita gain over 20 years that we talked about the planning would give you. But the problem is the difficult things are the things that actually get you most of that number. So it's the statutory consultees with respect to environment and heritage and those other things that tend to be the people who come in at the end of the day in any planning process and say you can't do this. So unless you're attacking those, you're going to get a very small percentage of that 7 or 8%. So it's not sufficient to say it. You have to actually do the things that will make those big changes. We've suggested, I think we need, first of all statutory consultees, I think, should be made advisory, not statutory, not required. The zonal planning systems, trusted developers, these are the kinds of things that will actually move the needle. And we're seeing a little bit of it, but not enough.
It strikes me that pretty much every recovery from recession in the UK in the last 100 years has been accompanied by, associated with a house building boom, with the exception of the post-global financial crisis recovery, which was the most tepid, limp recovery we've had from a major recession in our history. Part of the story is, of course, energy costs, as you said in your comment, Shanker, but part of the story surely is the lack of house building that we've seen, the increase in unaffordability, and so on, with all the societal knock-ons that has. Do you believe, John, this 1.5 million housing target that Labour are talking about, can they deliver?
Well, that's just rhetoric. The question is whether they can do the sorts of things that Shanker was saying need to be done. And in this matter of consultation, which you have to get rid of, I note that, I think it was last week, the judges said that one of the major reforms of Labour in the employment market hadn't been consulted enough, and on ECHR grounds they knocked it back, and now they have to go back and do more consultation. And if you look at the other economic changes Labour's trying to do, you see they put in huge sort of 6-month swathes of periods of consultation. Because it's back to the judges being in charge of what you're allowed to do, certainly so long as you're in the ECHR. So I suspect that 1.5 million is rhetoric.
And I would say, just politically, before we move on to the third of the big three, you've had climate change planning. Before we move on to labour markets, another big potential growth bonanza, as you say, Shanker. I would say the politics of this could go completely wrong if the right doesn't sort itself out, and a weakened Labour Party come through with Lib Dem help. Then any process we've made, of course, everyone knows that Lib Dem councils are the worst for blocking.
Yes.
Greenbelt, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, is now 158% bigger by area than it was in the late 1970s. I've done the maths on that. The Greenbelt is 13% of the land mass of England. Housing plus gardens is 2%. That's the reality. So the politics on this could get worse, right?
Yeah, very much.
So let's move on to the Employment Rights Bill. It strikes me that the Employment Rights Bill, it's been a bit like a kind of submarine. It hasn't really figured in the media's consciousness, though we all know, talk to SMEs, as I do all the time, that I think there's a parallel here. There's been a lot of coverage, rightly, of farmers' concerns about the abolition of agricultural property relief above £1 million. There's been almost no coverage of the concerns of family-owned businesses who are absolutely, very knowledgeable audience here, nodding from the waist, many of them, absolutely outraged, and rightly so, by the abolition of business property relief, which of course means that if you're passing on a family business, you could have such a ruinous tax bill, and so you're just going to end up selling a lot of these family-run businesses. They're big employers in small towns and regional cities, but the Employment Rights Bill is similar as well. Could be ruinous, Shanker, for a lot of the SMEs that everyone in this room knows are the engine room, the growth centre of the British economy. They employ 2/3 of people and generate at least half our growth.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a misunderstanding, I think, in the UK that we already have a very flexible labour market. So compared to some countries, certainly, I guess we do. But actually, compared to the really fast-growing economies, particularly in the US and other places, our labour market is not that flexible now, without any of these changes. So if you impose these changes, make it even less flexible, you're undercutting that element that could be a big mover in terms of GDP per capita. The basic principle, what makes it difficult to fire somebody makes it difficult to hire somebody. And that's particularly true of small businesses and some of the family-owned businesses you mentioned. So that's a big element. The other big element is the minimum wage, which has climbed and climbed and climbed, and is now well above the.
I must say, I was really struck by what you said there. I didn't realise how high our minimum wage was. Did you say it's 2/3 of median income, which is that's going straight in a Sunday Telegraph column.
Part of that is the reduction.
That's an outlier.
But we are an outlier
in the OECD.
We are right at the top of the, beyond the top of the OECD there. So, and again, this sort of assumption that somehow we have this completely flexible, employers can do what they will kind of labour market is not accurate.
Indeed, some big European labour markets, they're actually becoming more flexible. The French have become more flexible. The Germans have become more flexible. We seem to be going in the opposite direction.
That tends to be the direction of travel, because in a crisis where you've got no money and you've got to generate private sector economic activity, these are the kinds of things that you do. So,
John, you're one of the few people in the public sphere, if you like, heavily involved in the economic debate, who's actually built and run businesses successfully, employed thousands of people over the course of your career. Do you think Labour's got the stomach to bring about the kind of reforms that Shanker and the Growth Commission are talking about? Or do you think they really are going to go through with this Employment Rights Bill? And if they do, how damaging will it be?
The Employment Rights Bill is just awful, and it's enormous. It's 300 pages of really bad law, covering a wide swathe of things. I mean, let me sort of go back a little bit to what Shanker was talking about. If you have things like the employment rights law, if you have things like too high a national living wage or whatever they call it, the people who suffer are young people. Because in many ways it cements somebody in their job if they've already got it. But it makes it very, very unattractive
Get through the door.
for a new employer for an employer to hire a new person, particularly if they're young and clueless, which we all were when we were young. And what has been happening, even in the past couple of years, is youth unemployment in the UK, traditionally quite low relative to the EU, has been ticking up. Germany did these great reforms and also has this great education system that actually brought its youth unemployment low. We're still below France, Italy, and Spain and so forth, quite a lot below, but we're moving up towards them. And as you say, they're moving down. So I think, and now I'm going to ravel back to what you're talking about taxes. What all these tax changes are getting completely wrong is that, I mean, we all know that high economic growth comes from having small government, low taxes, low regulation. It's really quite straightforward and not that difficult.
Slaying the three devils that you talk about in your book, of course.
And of course, when you get to tax is sort of dragged up by the size of government, because if you're spending 50% of GDP on government expenditure, you can't have too big a gap between that and tax, or those gnomes will come after you with or without the help of pooling LDI funds. But it's not just how much tax you charge that limits growth. It's also the type of tax. And this will be another tremendously popular opportunity for the Labour government. The taxes that least hit economic growth are taxes on consumption, believe it or not. If you charge a tax on consumption, it doesn't really hit economic growth. If you charge a tax on business, it hits economic growth really, really badly.
At source.
Back to your point. It's really quite fascinating that, one of the interesting economies to look at, which people always come up with, is Denmark, which, despite having a large government, manages to grow, not fantastically, but better than most EU. Why? Because it has low regulation and because it has really low taxes on business. And so you get the Maersks and the Novo Nordisks being able to start up and grow dramatically. And we, in the UK, only charge half of all consumption VAT. We only charge VAT on half. Denmark charges VAT on all consumption, like 98% or something like that. And so I think it would be tremendously popular to start charging all those. No, well, it obviously wouldn't, and I don't know if Labour would do it. But that's one of the things is desperately important for us to do, is change the mix of our taxes and take the
away
burden
from
off
enterprise
business.
and towards consumption.
Exactly.
Preferably with both of them on a downward trend. On this point, let's just do the Laffer curve, the whole sort of conceptual methodology of where we are. A lot of people in this room will think, you know, don't keep raising taxes, Chancellor, whatever the left of your party wants, because you're just going to drag us deeper into a fiscal hole and maybe drive the economy off a cliff with a bond crisis and all the rest of it. Is this time for people on this side of the debate to really start shouting about the Laffer curve from the rooftops? Do you really believe in that curve?
Well, it depends where you are on it, of course, but I think we have a live experiment going on, which is the non-dom situation. We are seeing the imposition of those taxes causing behavioural change in real time and very quickly. So, yeah, I think that's a good example of making the point. It's always useful to have.
I'd say corporation tax is a good example as well. I know that you want to bring corporation tax down to 21 from 25, of course, where it currently is. You know, the first corporation tax increase in half a century by a Tory government from 19 to 25%. I've run the numbers on this, and I'm amazed these aren't more talked about.
Yeah.
If you look at where corporation tax was it 28 in 2010, and Osborne and Cameron, to their credit, they lowered it down to 19. During that period, not only did the nominal amount of tax you got from corporation tax go up, of course it did, because you have inflation in the system, corporation tax receipts as a percentage of GDP also went up as the rate came down from 28 to 19. Surely that means if you lower corporation tax now, when we're higher up the Laffer curve, I would say, you'd have that impact. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that what your modelling shows?
Certainly, and that's why we've sort of landed on that 21 number. The other thing is, with things like corporation tax and so forth, you know, it's a highly competitive global environment for capital, and we are at a sort of unfrozen moment because of what's going on with the US, where supply chains are moving. You know, people are making real decisions in boardrooms right now. Thinking, you know, well, how do I, you know, get more production capability into the US, for example? These decisions are being made now, and your attractiveness as a country to be a sort of magnet for the bits of the supply chain that make sense, that's really critical right now. So I think if you do something like that, it will have a fairly immediate effect.
Right, we're at quarter to the hour. Briefly, if I may, Shanker, if I may ask you to be brief, which is ironic given your massive expertise in this area, but I'm sure there'll be more of this in the Q&A. I do want to bring the audience in. Where are we, and then I'll come to John, where are we on tariffs? How bad do you think it could get? Should we take Trump seriously but not literally, or does he mean it?
That's what I've said, yeah. So I think on US tariff policy, you've basically got three strands that we need to think about. The first strand is the tariff imposition for non-trade related things. Fentanyl, you know, fentanyl laboratories in British Columbia, Mexico, Colombian flights, this sort of thing. Those tariffs are either never imposed or they are very short-lived. So you saw some of the Canadian sort of suggestions, you know, didn't last very long. First of all, there's nothing you can really do about that, and they're not a particular problem, I don't think. Second strand is tariffs for general revenue, which we don't hear a lot about. Now, this is a bit of a problem because it is going to be quite attractive for the US administration because you know, a relatively low tariff on everything, 4 or 5%, actually generates a lot of revenue and causes a currency appreciation a little bit in the US, a little bit of depreciation elsewhere. Put it all together, supply chains don't really change very much. So his bet is the size and attractiveness of the US market. I can do a little bit on that, and I'll raise a lot of money, about a third of current corporate
big
tax.
MAGA message, right? You pay for access to our market.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's going to be quite attractive and quite difficult to dislodge. But on the other hand, we don't hear a lot about it right now. The third strand is the important one. It's the thing we can do things about. It's the thing where we can sort of really respond, which is what's happening on April the 2nd, which is the unfair trade and reciprocal tariff measure. That is going to be a big tariff. It is going to hit all of the G20 countries, and it's going to be based on the level of distortions in the trading partners market. In other words, it's going to be based on how open is your trade regime. Is it less open than the US's, i.e. is your tariff higher? Secondly, do you have some of these things that I talked about in terms of competition and regulation? Are there regulatory barriers, etc.? Do you protect intellectual property rights? This sort of thing. All of that is going to be in this report that is going to land on the President's desk, being prepared by USTR right now. It's going to be hundreds of pages long. It already is hundreds of pages long. And by the way, just on that point, since Shadow Business and Trade Secretary is here, that there is a process right now in the UK of doing a trade strategy that DBT is doing. It has taken so long to do. This report was commissioned at the beginning of February. It will be over 1,000 pages long, and it will be done by April the 2nd. And it will be comprehensive, it will be clear, and it will be robust. And we need to do things a lot quicker in the UK, a lot more, less consultation, more actual action. But coming back to the tariff, so you're going to see this set of recommendations on countries. This is what the UK is going to have to engage with. Every country is going to have to engage with this. And the question that one of the things you have to do with Trump is, don't worry about everything he says. Think about what is causing that, what's underneath that. And what's underneath that is quite a reasonable and legitimate feeling that all of these barriers and restrictions and non-tariff measures we have totally failed to deal with over the last 30 years. They have spiraled out of control, and he's going to course correct and deal with them. And
so there could be an element of using protectionism to get more free trade.
Using the size and attractiveness
once the reciprocity's
of the US,
happened, the other countries aren't going to immediately lower. There's face here.
Well,
these are politicians. They beat their chests.
And this is why it's really important, and this is where I think there could be there needs more work, put it like that, to be done in the US, which is to make sure that the signals are very clear. Right. So this is a tariff on you because of your regulatory barrier in this area. I mean, if you read the report, it will be clear, but the messaging may not be clear. And if you change that, and you started to see some indications of this actually already. The fact that the Europeans are willing to talk about lowering the car tariff from 10 to 5, even before anything has happened, is interesting. But the big one, for decades, countries around the world have complained about the fact that India has what's called a bound rate, which is the tariff that they sort of bind in the WTO, which is way higher than their applied rate. So they can move around a lot and without a violation. Everyone has complained about this for decades, that it's absolutely intractable. Well, they're already talking about changing it.
Wow.
So if things like that start to happen, you could actually have a world where overall distortions actually go down, which would generate wealth, which would be a good result. On the other hand, if the signals are not clear, or if people don't do anything about them, then you're going to get a world where distortions increase and you're going to have real problems. So I think, the signal from the US has got to be clear, and our response in the UK to that signal, we have to first of all understand it. So the idea that the UK can do a digital-only trade deal, or an AI-only trade deal, not deal with agriculture, not deal with anything else, is fiction. This is not going to happen.
That's not how trade deals work.
But look at the chairman of
intersectoral trade-offs. That's what they're all about, right?
Exactly, and also this is what the US wants. So you look at the members of Congress, chairman of the International Trade Subcommittee, House Ways and Means, Adrian Smith, and Nebraska. I mean, these are big agricultural states, and they've all said, and all they want, to quote what they've said to us, is all we want is for you to commit to WTO compliance in your SPS regime and sound science. We've already done it. We've signed that in the CPTPP. It should not be difficult for us to do it.
Briefly, John, again, sorry to press. There's
absolutely.
voices here. Smoot-Hawley, of course, started as just an agricultural tariff, and as you
Exactly.
outline in your book, it rapidly escalated during its journey through both
Yes.
houses of Congress and became almost economy-wide. Is that where we might be?
Right, so I look for a firm foundation to stand on, and in that I become a free trade absolutist. Adam Smith, Ricardo, Cobden led to Britain becoming the greatest economy in the world for half a century. You've all heard Shanker be quite magisterial about this. He really understands it, and let us hope that it's true. We do agree that there are some very sensible people in the Trump administration who might well ensure that we avoid some of the worst of it. But there is this concern that Donald Trump is absolutely in love with tariffs and really likes imposing them. And there was a Federal Reserve study on the steel tariffs he put on in 2019. And it discovered that, hooray, it saved 1,000 jobs in the American steel industry. And, oh dear, it destroyed 75,000 jobs downstream in the value-added part.
Because they're using now more expensive steel, as an input.
Which they then can't compete with. So, and that's what happens. And that's the worry, that if he does indeed, and that's an example of what will happen. You shoot yourself in the foot with these tariffs, but you also shoot the whole world too, as you say, like Smoot-Hawley did. So if, in fact, Donald Trump is indeed absolutely so enamored of tariffs that he just keeps going on it, we could have a major world problem just because of that, which will hit us badly, will hit the whole world badly.
A magisterial panel indeed. Let's get some of the audience involved. Could I have a mic for John Redwood, please?
Thank you very much. Marvellous presentation. The question I'd like to raise is about migration. If you have a policy of inviting in a lot of low-income people and a lot of people who are either dependents or are illegals not allowed to work, then you will obviously create a big productivity problem. You will discourage businesses from spending money on training, enhancing value added, putting in computers and automation. But you will also have a massive public expenditure problem, leading to more spending, more deficits, higher interest rates, further deterrent. Now, the EU was the only group that tried to assess this in 2016, when they said the setup costs and first-year costs of a migrant coming into the EU would be €250,000. I think it's considerably more than that now for somebody coming into the UK. Shouldn't we highlight the fact that you need to build 3 cities the size of Southampton with all facilities, not just the houses, to house 1 year of migration into this country? We have no intention of doing that. And the impact on public spending, on social benefits, on subsidised housing, on extra health places is enormous.
Shanker, again, on this issue, the Overton window has rapidly shifted, no?
I think it has. I think partly because, I mean, where we model this is in the GDP per capita number, which you can see the massive decline of, and a lot of that is, a lot of that is to do with massively increasing immigration numbers. So that's how we kind of pick it up. But you're absolutely right. There are also lots of other effects that come from this. I think the window on immigration generally is changing, and I think what we have to get towards, and what good looks like in this world is a genuine needs-based immigration system with full enforcement of the law, and those are two separate things.
You've now got red wall Labour MPs lobbying Starmer to leave the ECHR to make sure deportations happen, because they're the talk of working men's clubs, working people's clubs, sorry, across the north of England. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it is, as with many of these things that we talk about, it is the poorest in the socio-economic ladder who get hit the hardest by a lot of this. And in fact, business groups tend to take the view, this is all great because it's lowering the cost of labour, and it's going directly to our bottom line. But the people paying for it typically are the people at the bottom end of the socio-economic ladder.
You got a thought on that, John?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to understand it all starts with the OBR, because the government is in hock with the OBR, and the government needs to put forward spring statements, whatever, that show economic growth, and the OBR merrily forecast that this year we'd have 2% economic growth, and they've now cut that down to 1%. Not
About 1%. That's the
about
current
1%.
official line.
Well, naught is about 1.
Yeah.
More likely. So you have to do. The OBR has to say, tick, yes, you're doing things that will lead to that. Well, what are their assumptions about immigration? And I found this really difficult to believe, and I still feel nervous saying it, but I've looked it up, and it was there in their set of assumptions that they publicized last year. Every immigrant brings no dependents and always gets a job. Those two assumptions. Now, you know, the million immigrants we just heard claiming benefits, so that's not right, and we know they bring dependents. And I'm not necessarily talking about illegal immigration, which is bad enough, but don't forget, and everybody looks at net immigration. No, look at gross immigration, because it's netted out against a whole bunch of non-doms, millionaires, high earners going off to Dubai, Australia, whatever. Spain.
Yep.
So look at the gross number and put some proper assumptions in, and you'll find that not only do they massively hit GDP per capita, but they'll also hit GDP overall. It's a real problem, and it's absolutely baffling to me that there have been and continue to be so many immigrants. It's up this year. I was looking at it last night, and it's going up both illegal and legal. And they're talking about this Boris wave, where apparently now Boris is to blame for it all being...
2013, right? It's from the AA accession.
Yeah, and it's kept going up. But I'm absolutely baffled as to why some apparently competent Conservative ministers failed to get a grip on the Home Office and get immigration down, because it's clearly not a smart thing to be doing. But it all starts with the OBR, and that's I suppose, why they do it.
John makes a good point here, which is you need to look at the dynamic aspects of this and the connections between things. So if you are simultaneously, through the non-dom stuff, getting your productive, high-performing people, they are leaving, and you're essentially replacing them with unproductive. You know, it's
you're replacing
a lot worse.
people who employ people with people who need to be employed and quite often aren't employed.
That's a much bigger change than just, you know, if you look at the sum of the parts.
Let's have a mic for Andrew Griffiths, Shadow Business Secretary. Nice to see you in real life rather than on social media.
Much nicer to be here in real life. Thank you. And thank you for the brilliant work of the Growth Commission. It's one of the groups as we seek to open our eyes to policy, to come up with a framework. I mean, John's books are absolute, tablets of stone for how we should be looking to reframe the Conservative economic agenda. Your conversation ranged into that since Liam caught my eye, but the most damaging thing, and the one area that's going counter-trend on exports, is the export of young people, of wealth and talent. And I just wondered, I suspect that is an under-researched area, because although we have some of the very simplistic loss to the Treasury in terms of direct taxes on non-doms, but also a generation of young people who are just, because of positive discrimination, affirmative action, because of the state of our education system, are concluding their education now overseas as well. I would just encourage the Growth Commission to apply your brilliant work to that. And unlike many of the other policies, I think that's going to be enormously hard for us to reverse. Because if people have gone to a different country, they've put down roots, they've settled, they've found love, how do we get them back, even if we get a Conservative government that comes in, says and does all of the right things, but people will naturally be sceptical about putting their worldwide assets back into the clutches of a state that's proven itself to be quite Marxist at times. Not under us, that's a judgment on this lot. So that was my...
Highest tax burden in 70 years.
I'll conclude there.
Sorry. Yeah, I think that's a extremely important observation, and we will certainly sort of look at that and what we can do. But I think, in general terms, the way to reverse these things, first of all, you can't just. I mean, yes, I think we should, and we've recommended that you eliminate the non-dom tax. Get that, replay that. But I think what you have to do is understand the world we actually live in right now is a world of massive change in terms of movement of people and movement of supply chains. And if you can create the conditions that attract capital into the UK, a lot of things will follow. And that's one of the reasons we're so robust in our recommendation about doing the deal with the US. We think CPTPP was a really important element of pillar of UK strategy. We have to align ourselves to fast-growing countries in the world. And if we do that successfully and improve our regulatory system and don't do things that prevent us from improving our regulatory system, then supply chains and the people who service them will come back to the country.
Liz Truss, please. You helped set up the Growth Commission, of course, Liz. How do you think they're doing?
I think very well. If the Growth Commission was in charge of this country rather than the current government, I think we'd be in a much better position. I wanted to follow up about John's point about the OBR, which is absolutely critical to this, because I believe that even if Rachel Reeves wanted to do all the things that the Growth Commission has outlined, she wouldn't actually be able to, because of the nature of the forecast produced by the OBR. John outlined how they're completely wrong on migration, but they're also completely wrong on the Laffer curve, they're completely wrong on net zero, and the same ideology is also present in the Treasury and the Bank of England. And we have a massive problem with an unaccountable bureaucracy. And I think it's very interesting that last week a Labour MP called Jonathan Hinder from Pendle and Clitheroe actually wrote an article saying we have a problem as the Labour Party because we don't really run the economy. It's run by the OBR, who are all, he said in his article, they're always wrong. He said there's a problem with the accountability of the Bank of England for interest rate decisions. So I think it's very interesting that even Labour MPs are now starting to question the structure, because they're seeing that the OBR has got it wrong. I mean, if you look at what happened with Reeves's budget last year, essentially she's having to redo it. I mean, this week is redoing her homework because the OBR got their assumptions completely wrong. And what we know is they're already wrong because the statistics have changed over the last week, so things are going to be even worse in the autumn. So my question is, are we seeing the Overton window start to shift on the role of these so-called independent bodies who've been shown to be ideologically motivated and wrong time and time again?
And indeed, let's broaden it out, the civil service as a whole. You've talked a lot about how policy was thwarted by activist civil servants. The current leader of the opposition has talked a lot about that as well. You talked about how is it that immigration suddenly ballooned. We've had a succession of senior ministers, former Home Secretaries, say, well, you've got so many activists in Whitehall, you literally can't govern, you literally can't do what you were democratically elected to do. Shanker, as a rational, obviously we're all rational people, but as you know, you made your reputation as a non-partisan, technocratic, if I may say so, numbers-driven analyst. Do you see some of these trends in Whitehall as well? You've operated in many government departments.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of fundamental challenges that the UK has in terms of translating the will of the people through its elected representatives into action that it can take. The first thing is, let's talk about the civil service. Lots of brilliant civil servants, lots of them want to do really good things, but the structure is such that the heads of departments are accountable to the cabinet secretary, not the minister. And unless you fundamentally change that, and I've advocated, and I would say now that what you actually want to do is to have more appointments of the incoming government into the civil service at deeper levels. That does not mean they're politicians. It means that they are experts. They're people who have lived in the real world and know how these things actually work. So I think unless you're at least prepared to do what New Zealand does, which is the permanent secretary, the head of department, has a performance contract with the minister. Unless you're at least able to do that, there's not going to be any reform of that. Everything else is just tinkering at the edges. So that's one thing. The role of bodies like the OBR and sort of some of these, quotes, quangos, it's the same independence point I made before, which is, in this desperation for independence, what have we made them independent from? And what forces actually capture them? If you make someone completely independent from, and when you say you're trying to make someone independent from politicians or from the political process, you're saying you're trying to make them independent from the people, because the people ultimately vote for those politicians and so on. So if you make them independent of that, they're going to be captured by somebody, and they end up being captured by status quo forces that don't want to see any change. And that, I think, in a sense, while we were members of the EU and a lot of these major decisions were Brussels decisions, you could afford to get away with this. Now that we can't, you can't get away with this anymore. You have to actually, ministers have to make decisions. They have to, and not just, this isn't civil servants advise, ministers decide. We all know that if the advice is a certain way, the decision is preordained.
Especially if it's leaked beforehand.
But the minister has to act.
As it often is.
The minister has to actually be in charge of making decisions and be able to follow through with those actions. And a lot has to change to accomplish that. But I think if you're going to get the kind of growth that we need to get in order to succeed as a country, all of this has to happen. And I do think there's a view in the public now that something is wrong, and it does need to be changed.
John, I just want to bring your response, if I may, back to Liz's point
question.
Specifically, because forgive me, I broadened it out somewhat. You're a self-confessed non-economist. I think you used that phrase at least half a dozen times in your books. But you've written two really great books about the economy. You've absorbed a lot of economics in the writing of those books, as you have throughout your business life. The former Prime Minister said, didn't she, quite famously, I thought, it's a good phrase, forecasts aren't destiny, and yet we seem to be locked in this political parlour game when we're arguing about, percentage, tenths of percentage points of the differences between two massive numbers 5 years hence, and yet we're getting the next quarter's borrowing numbers wrong, not just in terms of magnitude, but in some cases direction as well. It's complete madness. Yes. I'm a qualified econometrician. It's all guesswork. It's all complete guesswork and politics. But how can we free ourselves from this? Because if a chancellor stood up at the dispatch box now and said, I'm going to abolish the OBR, the guilty would go to the moon. Because it would be seen as a sign of massive irresponsibility.
Well,
tell the story. Let's come to David Davis in a minute. John.
Okay, Liz's question was, is the Overton window changing? And I think the answer is yes, very much so. The Overton window is changing for those subject to democratic constraint, because they know they're going to get kicked out, because they know that the old way isn't working. Where the Overton window is not moving is in what we all came to call the blob. And it's the blob that in fact rules our world. And it's the civil servants, it's the regulators, it's the quangos, it's the universities, and these are all people who interchange with each other all the time, move back and forth. And it's what I called a long time ago government by WhatsApp, because there's this whole subterranean world of which we wot not, of people WhatsApping each other, so that amazingly the same message appears at the IMF as at the LSE, as at the leak from the OBR within a day of each other. And very occasionally a WhatsApp will surface, we'll go, wow, You know, I see they're all talking to each other, but they're not changing because they're convinced that they're correct.
So we need some kind of consensus smasher, right?
Well, I think, you know, in my book, I say certainly for the civil service, you have to take HR out of the civil service. HR now reports to the minister, and if you don't like that person, you fire them. Now, apparently this is a very controversial thing, although in any company, you know, if you had a CEO who isn't doing what you told him, what the board's telling him to do, you fire them. But you can't do that so, I mean, there's so many things that you could do to smash that blob, but it would be very, very difficult. And there's nobody saying that they plan to do that at the moment.
Let's bring in, if I may, David Davis. And Steve Baker, don't think you're going to get away with sitting in the corner writing your Substack. I'm bringing in you in next. You're in Westminster postcode, so you're fair.
Number one, you're right. You're right about direct accountability to ministers. I mean, at the end of the day, as far as I'm concerned, that's the key thing. In the last several governments, I won't put a number on them, only about 10% of the ministers did their job, which is to tell the civil servants what to do and then make sure they do it. And it's difficult. I've got John Redwood sitting next to me. That happened once before under a previous Prime Minister. It wasn't any easier for Margaret Thatcher's government to deal with a civil service that believed its job was a managed decline, and they turned that around. So the first thing is not about other institutions, it's that. Second thing is we appear not to be able to make a distinction between independent and unaccountable. I mean, only less than a month ago, the Lady Chief Justice attacked both the Leader of the Opposition and the Prime Minister for criticising a judge's plainly stupid judgment. Right? Now, she seems to think that we're not allowed to criticise the judges.
Exactly.
At the dispatch box.
Yeah.
Parliament's full.
Yeah, exactly. That's where we are. So
Liz had that problem years ago.
you've got all of that. But the last thing is the point you brought me in on, really. And it's this. If you're going to change things, you've got to prepare the ground. The coalition that John was talking about, of course, includes the London media. You know? And the London media only tell one story.
Yeah.
You know? So take the OBR issue. I mean, I nagged Jeremy Hunt when he was Chancellor. I said, why don't you just shut the OBR down? Why don't you? And he kept wouldn't answer me in the Commons. He'd come to me in a tea room and say, the markets would collapse. I said, well, not if you explain what a rotten job they're doing. You have to start by doing that. You know, every revolution has to start with the people understanding what the revolution is.
Is now the time to do it when the gilt yield is consistently above 4.5%?
I mean,
going in the opposite. The Bank of England's cutting rates, the gilt yield's going up.
But
that shows market distress.
Listen, this government's beyond recall. I'm in opposition now. My party now is precisely the time to do it. It's precisely the time to do it. We have to start winning these arguments now. And I want to ask a question at the end of all this. And it's to Shanker. It's plain as Pikestaff what the right direction is. I mean, you gave the numerical, the quantitative element of it, but you know we don't want to go down the route of continuous alignment with the EU. That's economic suicide. We need to go a free trade route. The key player in this is America. You've been there just recently. Is there a winnable political case to win them over there?
Great question.
I think there is. I think there is. But we will have to answer the president's question. You know, the problem is quite often people will. One of the ways not to deal with the current president is to try to answer your own question. We have to answer his question. His question to the UK will be very direct and it will be very obvious, which is you've got a digital sales tax. You've got VAT on US exporters into the UK, so it's not at consumption; it's actually at the business level. You've got all of these regulatory barriers. You've got SPS regulatory barriers. There's about 50 things, right? So and we have to answer at least 20 of them. You know, some of them. You don't have to answer everything, but you have to answer some of them. If that's the conversation you're having, then I think there's a good result here, because he's clearly predisposed to do something with the UK. You all saw the meeting of the Prime Minister in the Oval Office.
Does he want to show that Brexit makes sense?
I think he is more interested in what damage is being done to US exporters than anything else, and US manufacturing, and why is, what can you solve that problem? I think he's probably, he likes the idea of Brexit. I think that's certainly true. But they're going to be very hard-nosed about this. Just because you're the UK does not mean you're going to get any special favours. If you don't answer the questions, you'll get the tariff. Answer the questions, answer some of the questions. Now, where being the UK does matter, I think, is if the EU answers only 20 of the 50 questions, they'll get a tariff. If we answer only 20 of the 50 questions, maybe we won't. I mean, but you're going to have to go some way towards doing that. And if you do, I think you could get a good result here.
If I may, John, we're almost at 11:20, which is our hard stop. Let's just hear from Steve Baker, who, of course, left Parliament happily, it seems to me. If your Facebook is anything to go by, lots of parachuting and motorcycling. And then once Steve's had his say, maybe a question to you, we'll get final comments from both of you. Steve Baker.
Well, it's wonderful to be amongst so many friends. I just want to first say that Shanker's being very bashful, because before I joined the government in 2017, Shanker's Legatum Institute Special Trade Commission had written the UK's trade policy strategy, and then, of course, Plan A+, which David in particular did a lot to promote, and John, set it out further. And we owe a great debt of gratitude to Shanker for setting out a UK trade policy, which the UK actually, after a great deal of effort, is now following. And also to John, I mean, I would just say I wish I'd written your book, because it's absolutely amazing. To hear Andrew say tablets of stone about it.
That's going on the cover of the next edition.
I'm tweeting that out as soon as I've got the photos. That's what I was taking. As soon as I get out of here and I've got some signal, I'm tweeting that out, because he's right. Tablets of stone. So I suppose the question is, to all of us who are Conservatives, we've all got a lot of history together in this room. We have to ask ourselves why we didn't do this in government. But where I take a lot of encouragement is we are now, thanks to John and Shanker and Liam and others, we're now better equipped than ever before to do what needs to be done in this country. And the question to you guys, as observers of politics from a remove out, is what do we need to do to make popular what you have rightly said this country needs to do?
I think that's a great question to end on. Final comments from both of you. Thank you, Steve. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I mean, that is a great question, because I think what we have to do, the simplest answer to your question is we have to show that when we talk about this GDP per capita number, we're talking about a number that if you make, less than 50,000, less than 30,000 a year, is a big number for you. Right? It's going to really change your life. And if you make $1 million, then it's not going to change your life. But this is more important, this stuff that we talk about is more important for the people who are the poorest, for the people who are working, average working people. Yeah. Those are the people who are going to see the biggest benefits of this type of change. And that's a message we don't always get across very well.
Last word goes to the author of those tablets of stone, John Moses Moynihan.
Well, those tablets, whether of stone or of chewing gum, do have a program in them that says this is how you get there. And it basically says just go back to the year 2000 under none other than Tony Blair, with Peter Mandelson saying he's intensely relaxed about people getting rich, and generally a size of government and a level of tax that did allow for quite significant economic growth, as indeed Shanker's, I think the first chart you showed. If there's one thing I feel I'd just like to throw a little bit more in, is on Andrew's point, which I see he's got signal and he's tweeting out as we sit here, or at least so my watch is telling me. Andrew's point about all these people leaving, because I don't think we can over-exaggerate how appalling this is. What an enormous flood of people is leaving. And I believe, I suspect that most of you in this room will know people who are leaving. And when you speak to your accountant, they say they've got lots of clients leaving. And when you speak to moving people, they tell you that I had some centimillionaire wanting to move all his furniture out of London off to Dubai. And I told him he'd have to wait a month or two because I've got such a backlog of people I'm moving out of this country. And it is non-DOMs, and you do have to reverse that, although quite frankly it's going to take decades for them to want to come back. But that's, as you were saying, Andrew, a tiny proportion of who's leaving. It's people who are about to sell their business for 100 million. So they go down to Monte Carlo and sell it there, so they don't have to pay 25% capital gains tax and give 25 million away. They'll do it. Whether you like it or not, they'll do it. It's people who want to leave their business to their children, and in particular with this new business tax, they're going off to Australia where there's no inheritance tax. It's people who are, as you say, in their late 20s, earning 150,000 a year and can get the same job in Dubai and pay virtually no tax. And why not? And they go off there. It's people who work for centimillionaires and who are losing their jobs as house manager or chauffeur or whatever. And they go off to Dubai to work out there. It's hairdressers. A lot of the best hairdressers in London are leaving England and going off to wherever because they can earn more and pay less tax. It's beauticians. It's just this huge swathe of people leaving this country, and it really makes you cry that we're losing some of the best and the brightest. And it's of course the entrepreneurs who can't stand the idea of high corporate tax, high capital gains tax, and so forth, and massive regulation that stops them building their businesses. So if there's one thing we could do, it's just totally revamp the tax system and say that we are open for business, we're open for young people to do well.
Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to say thank you to the Growth Commission for asking me to chair this debate, to congratulate the Growth Commission, Shanker and his team, and indeed to congratulate Jonathan Isaby in pulling this event together. And please join me, ladies and gentlemen, in giving the panel a round of applause.
Thank you, Liam, very much. A final word of thanks to you, Liam, for indeed chairing the session. Thank you to our friends at the CSJ for allowing us to use this space, and thank you to our donors who allow everything we do to happen. We couldn't do it without you. If you are a donor already, thank you very much. If you're not but would like to be, then please talk to me. I'd like to have a conversation. Thank you very much indeed. Shanker is due on the radio in 5 minutes.